What happens when the most unbreakable human resolve collides with an apocalyptic force of nature that simply refuses to let you survive? Have you ever looked out at a howling blizzard through the complete safety of a double-paned, insulated window and felt a sudden primal shudder, a deep-seated, terrifying realization that if you were somehow trapped out there in the freezing void, you would not even last a single night? Today we view extreme weather as a temporary inconvenience. We get alerts on our smartphones, we turn up our digital thermostats, and we wait for the government plows to clear the heavy concrete highways. But I want you to completely strip away every single safety net of the modern world and travel back in time to the darkest, most unforgiving days of the Great Depression. Imagine you are one of America's first long-haul truck drivers. You are a hardened, leather-skinned pioneer who has already survived the brutal, open-air conditions of the 1920s. You have built a legendary reputation as a man made of iron, someone who can muscle a 10-ton mechanical beast over frozen dirt trails, cheating death every single night with kerosene bonfires and crumpled newspapers for insulation. By the mid-1930s, you think you have mastered the winter. You think your grit, your unparalleled mental endurance, and your sheer willpower have made you completely invincible to the elements. You believe that there is no mountain pass too steep and no snowstorm too severe to stop your freight from moving. But nature has a terrifying way of punishing arrogance. What you do not know, as you grip that massive freezing steering wheel, is that the atmosphere is actively conspiring to unleash a meteorological nightmare so devastating that it will not just challenge your survival tactics, it will entirely dismantle the myth of the invincible trucker. This is the harrowing, forgotten story of the winter of 1936, a season of such unprecedented, relentless, and catastrophic cold that it physically and psychologically destroyed the toughest generation of men to ever drive the American highways, changing the transportation industry forever. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe that was about to unfold, you have to understand the immense, almost delusional level of confidence these early truckers possessed just before the storm hit. These were men who had been forged in the absolute worst conditions imaginable. They were World War I veterans who had survived the freezing, muddy trenches of Europe. They were desperate fathers fighting off the crushing poverty of the Great Depression. Men who knew that if they did not deliver their loads of coal, timber, and food, their families would literally starve to death in the streets. Because of this monumental economic pressure, their resolve was not just a temporary mental state, it was their only currency. It was the only thing standing between their survival and total ruination. They had spent the last decade perfecting the dark art of extreme cold weather survival. They knew exactly how much raw alcohol to pour into the radiator to stop the water from freezing into a solid block of ice. They knew the precise, terrifying method of lighting a controlled fire underneath the oil pan just to thaw the engine sludge enough to turn the hand crank without snapping their arms in half. They had normalized the agonizing pain of frostbite, treating blackened fingertips and numb toes as just another occupational hazard. No different than a flat tire or a blown head gasket. They operated with a fierce solitary pride, believing that their primitive rattling trucks, machines composed of rigid cast iron, splintering wood, and heavy canvas were extensions of their own iron wills. They looked at the darkening winter skies of late 1935 with a defiant smirk, entirely unaware that the jet stream was shifting, pulling down a colossal, dense mass of Arctic air directly from the polar ice caps, an air mass that was about to blanket the entire North American continent in a suffocating grip of absolute zero. They thought they were preparing for just another tough winter, but they were actually driving straight into a frozen apocalypse. But I need you to stop and ask yourself something genuinely terrifying right now. What do you do when absolutely all of your hard-earned survival tricks, the very rituals and desperate measures that have kept you alive against all odds for years, suddenly and completely stop working? The winter of 1936 did not just arrive, it slammed into the continent like a physical wall of freezing concrete. In a matter of hours, temperatures across the Great Plains and the Midwest plummeted from a manageable freezing point to an incomprehensible 30, 40, and even 50 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. And it did not just stay there for a day or two, it locked in for weeks of sustained lethal cold, accompanied by relentless howling winds that created whiteout blizzards so dense you could not see your own hand pressed against the frozen windshield. When the first wave of this megastorm hit the trucking routes, the drivers immediately resorted to their standard survival protocols. They layered themselves in thick wool, stuffed every inch of their clothing with insulating newspapers, and prepared to fight the machine. But this cold was an entirely different predator. It was so profoundly deep that the very laws of physics that the drivers relied upon began to break down. The rudimentary anti-freeze solutions they poured into their radiators instantly turned into a useless icy slush, expanding and violently cracking the heavy cast-iron engine blocks right down the middle, rendering the trucks instantly and permanently dead. The crude, heavy oil in the crankcases didn't just thicken. It solidified into a substance as hard as asphalt. When drivers desperately crawled underneath their rigs into the howling wind to light their customary survival fires, the wind was so vicious, and the ambient temperature was so staggeringly low that the flames were immediately snuffed out. Even if they managed to keep a small fire burning, the heat was instantaneously stolen by the freezing vortex before it could even begin to warm the metal. The trucks, their only source of livelihood and their only pathetic shelter against the storm, were rapidly transforming into frozen steel tombs. The mechanical failure was absolute and catastrophic, but the physical reality of being trapped inside these dead machines was a horror that is almost impossible to articulate. Imagine sitting in a wooden cab with a canvas roof that is violently snapping and tearing under the force of 70-mile-per-hour winds. There is no heater, there is no insulation, the temperature inside the cab is dropping to minus 40 degrees. Every single breath you take feels like inhaling a handful of razor blades. The freezing air searing your lungs and causing your chest to violently spasm. The moisture from your breath instantly crystallizes, coating the inside of the canvas, the wooden steering wheel, and your own eyebrows in a thick, suffocating layer of white frost. You are shivering so violently that your teeth are chipping together, and your muscles are cramping in pure agony as your body desperately tries to generate thermal energy that is immediately sucked away by the merciless void. These drivers, men of unparalleled toughness, realized with a creeping cold dread that their resolve, no matter how unbreakable it had been in the past, could not generate physical heat. They could not out-tough thermodynamics as the hours dragged on into the pitch black. Screaming night, the physical damage began to rapidly accelerate. Fingers that were desperately gripping the steering wheel lost all sensation, transitioning from an excruciating burning pain to a terrifying heavy numbness. The blood vessels in their extremities aggressively constricted, sacrificing the hands and feet in a desperate biological attempt to keep the vital organs warm. They were fully awake, fully aware, and forced to endure the horrifying realization that their bodies were slowly freezing solid while they were still alive inside them. They were trapped miles from any town, buried under snowdrifts that were rapidly rising to 10, 15, and 20 feet high, completely erasing the roads and isolating them from the rest of the human race. Have you ever been so physically decimated and mentally broken by exhaustion and pain that your own mind actually turns against you, whispering beautiful, comforting lies just to convince you to finally give up and die? This is the most insidious and terrifying phase of extreme hypothermia, and it is the exact psychological nightmare that began to claim the minds of America's toughest truckers during that catastrophic winter. As their core body temperatures plummeted past the critical threshold of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, their brains, starved of warm, oxygen-rich blood, began to violently misfire. The relentless, deafening roar of the blizzard outside the canvas flaps began to warp and distort into strange, hallucinatory sounds. Drivers who survived to tell the tale later recounted hearing phantom choirs singing in the wind, or the voices of their wives and children calling out to them from the blinding white snowdrifts. Their vision blurred and narrowed, and the pitch-black, frozen cabin began to play horrific tricks on their perception. But the most dangerous hallucination of all was the sudden, overwhelming sensation of false warmth. It is a documented medical phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. As the brain shuts down, the muscles controlling the blood vessels suddenly completely relax, sending a massive final rush of relatively warm blood from the core back to the freezing extremities. To the delirious dying driver, it felt as though a massive radiant heater had suddenly been turned on inside the cab. They would suddenly feel inexplicably hot, tearing off their thick wool coats, ripping away their newspaper insulation, and sometimes even throwing open the frozen canvas doors to the sub-zero blizzard, completely convinced that they were sitting next to a roaring fireplace in a cozy living room. In their final moments, their legendary resolve did not break. It was simply bypassed by a brain that had decided the pain of fighting was too great. They surrendered to the comforting, lethal hallucination of warmth, drifting off to sleep with smiles on their faces, while the minus 50-degree wind froze them into absolute statues. Now, I want you to picture this agonizing scenario and ask yourself the most difficult moral question imaginable. If you were trapped in your own freezing truck, barely clinging to life, and you looked out through the frost-covered glass and saw a fellow driver stranded and freezing to death just 50 yards away. But you knew that leaving your fragile shelter meant you would almost certainly die in the snow. What would you choose? For years, the early truckers had operated on an unspoken, ironclad code of the highway: you never ever leave a brother behind. In the 1920s and early 1930s, this brotherhood was their only safety net. If you saw a broken-down rig, you stopped. You shared your kerosene, and you cranked their engine until your arms bled. But the winter of 1936 was so aggressively lethal that it shattered this sacred brotherhood into a million frozen pieces. The storm created monstrous, impenetrable snowdrifts that trapped entire convoys of trucks in long, agonizing lines on the major mountain passes and the great open plains. Drivers were literally parked within sight of one another. But the 70-mile-per-hour winds and the blinding whiteout conditions made it physically impossible to walk even 10 feet between the vehicles. If a driver attempted to open his door to check on the man in the truck ahead of him, the wind would instantly rip the door off its hinges, filling his cab with a mountain of snow and guaranteeing his immediate death. So they were forced to sit there, shivering in the dark, watching the dim yellow headlights of the trucks around them flicker and slowly die out one by one as the engines froze and the batteries failed. They knew exactly what was happening in those other cabs. They knew their friends, their fellow pioneers, were slowly suffocating in the cold, screaming in pain, and eventually succumbing to the silent sleep of hypothermia. The absolute psychological torture of being surrounded by your brotherhood, yet being completely, utterly powerless to save them, broke the minds of men who had previously thought themselves entirely impervious to emotional pain. They were forced to listen to the wind howl, knowing it was the sound of an entire generation of truckers being systematically wiped off the map. Some men, however, driven by sheer panic or a final explosive burst of desperate adrenaline, refused to just sit in their cabs and wait for the end. They made the fateful, terrifying decision to abandon their frozen trucks and try to walk through the apocalyptic blizzard to find help. They would wrap their heads in thick wool blankets, tie ropes around their waists to keep from blowing away, and step out into a blinding, suffocating wall of white violence. They believed that if they just kept their legs moving, if they just focused all their immense willpower on taking one more step, they could beat the storm to the nearest farmhouse or unplowed town. But the winter of 1936 had no respect for human willpower. The snowdrifts were not soft powder. They were packed so densely by the hurricane-force winds that they were like jagged concrete. The cold was so absolute that it instantly froze the fluid in their eyes, rendering them completely blind within minutes of leaving the cab. Without any visual reference, they would immediately lose all sense of direction, stumbling blindly in circles just feet away from their trucks until they collapsed from total cardiovascular exhaustion. The wind chill factor was so extreme that exposed skin would freeze solid in less than 60 seconds, turning the flesh a horrifying, dead white before turning black with instant, irreversible frostbite. The sheer physical exertion of fighting the waist-deep snow and the suffocating wind would cause their lungs to hemorrhage. They were not just freezing to death. They were being battered, suffocated, and beaten into the ground by a storm that felt personal. A storm that seemed specifically designed to eradicate the very concept of human toughness. The roads became graveyards, littered with the frozen, contorted bodies of men who had dared to think they could outwalk the apocalypse. So, how does an entire industry, an industry built entirely on the backs of these invincible outlaws and romanticized as the ultimate frontier of American masculinity, ever recover when the spring thaw finally reveals the horrifying, undeniable cost of that single catastrophic winter? When the brutal weeks of the 1936 freeze finally broke, and the massive, monolithic snowdrifts slowly began to melt away under the returning sun, the true, ghastly scale of the devastation was finally exposed to the world. Highway patrols and recovery crews, finally able to navigate the roads, were met with a scene straight out of a horror movie. Hundreds of trucks were found buried in the snowbanks, their canvas roofs shredded, their engine blocks violently cracked open like fragile eggs. Inside these frozen tombs, they found the bodies of the legendary drivers. Some were huddled under massive, useless piles of rigid newspapers, their hands still clutching the frozen iron steering wheels in a final, defiant grip of rigor mortis. Others were found in the terrifying postures of paradoxical undressing, half-naked and frozen solid, with delirious smiles etched onto their lifeless faces. The bodies of those who had tried to walk for help were found perfectly preserved in the melting snowdrifts, sometimes just a few tragic feet away from the warmth of a farmer's barn. They had been unable to see in the blinding whiteout. The sheer loss of life was unprecedented, staggering, and deeply traumatic for the entire nation. It was a massive collective wake-up call that violently shattered the illusion of the invincible trucker. The industry was forced to face the incredibly harsh, undeniable truth: no amount of mental resolve, no amount of physical toughness, and no amount of cowboy bravado could ever defeat a -50-degree blizzard in a wooden box. The era of pure, unadulterated human suffering as a badge of honor was officially over. Violently executed by the weather. The traumatic aftermath of this singular, apocalyptic winter permanently and fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the American trucking industry. The companies and the manufacturers realized that they could no longer rely solely on the biological endurance of desperate men to move their freight. The catastrophic loss of life and the massive destruction of cargo forced the immediate development and implementation of life-saving technology. The winter of 1936 became the grim catalyst for the enclosed, fully insulated steel cab. It was the absolute driving force behind the invention and mandatory installation of the first primitive but functional cabin heaters that utilized the engine's hot coolant to actually blow warm air onto the shivering driver. It spurred the chemical engineering of highly advanced synthetic antifreeze solutions and multi-viscosity engine oils that would not turn into solid rock when the temperature plummeted. The government, terrified by the sheer number of frozen bodies pulled from the highways, began to slowly implement the very first stringent safety regulations, laying the absolute groundwork for the modern, highly regulated supply chain we rely on today. But while the trucks slowly became safer, warmer, and vastly more technologically advanced, the deep psychological scar left by the winter of 1936 remained forever etched into the DNA of the trucking profession. It created a deep generational reverence for the awesome, terrifying, and completely uncontrollable power of nature. It taught every subsequent generation of drivers that while grit and determination are absolutely essential for the job, true survival requires respecting the limits of the human machine. The men who perished in those frozen wooden cabs were not weak. They were the absolute toughest men to ever walk the earth. They were simply the ultimate sacrifice, the tragic pioneers whose suffering and death finally forced the world to build a better, safer machine around the unbreakable human spirit. As we look back at the horrifying reality of what those men endured, it forces us to deeply reevaluate our own modern definitions of hardship and resilience. We complain about a 10-minute delay in a heated traffic jam, while they sat in total darkness, breathing in toxic fumes, watching their own hands turn black with frostbite, simply because they refused to abandon their post. They were the ultimate embodiment of raw, unfiltered resolve. They did not have the luxury of giving up, so they pushed themselves past the very boundaries of biological possibility until nature simply snapped them in half. They are the forgotten ghosts of the interstate, the silent sentinels whose frozen sacrifices paved the smooth, heated highways we carelessly drive upon today. Their unimaginable suffering built the foundation of the modern supply chain, proving that sometimes the greatest leaps in human progress are born from the most devastating, unfathomable tragedies. So, the next time you're sitting in your climate-controlled car, listening to the heated vents softly blowing warm air against your face, while the snow falls gently on your windshield, I want you to take a long, hard look into the swirling white storm. I want you to look past the modern infrastructure and try to envision a solitary, freezing man in a wooden cab, desperately fighting a kerosene fire under a frozen engine, fully aware that he is living out his final hours on Earth. I want you to remember the absolute terrifying brutality of the winter of 1936, the single season that proved that even the toughest, most unyielding men in American history could still be broken by the cold. Now, I want to hear directly from you in the comments section down below. What is the absolute most desperate, terrifying situation you have ever found yourself in where you had to rely entirely on your own willpower and resolve just to make it through? Have you ever been pushed to a physical limit where your mind started playing tricks on you? Drop your most intense survival stories down below, because I make it a point to read absolutely every single one of them. The human spirit is capable of incredible things, and sharing those moments keeps the legacy of survival alive. If this deep, harrowing dive into the darkest, most tragic winter in the entire history of American transportation profoundly changed the way you look at the trucks rolling down the highway today, I need you to smash that like button right now. Hitting that like button is the only way to signal to the algorithm that these deeply important, forgotten historical stories deserve to be pushed out to a much wider audience so that these legendary men are never forgotten. And if you are craving more intense, untold stories of unparalleled human endurance, mechanical history, and the sheer power of unbreakable resolve against impossible odds, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you never miss a single upload. The road of history is paved with the incredible sacrifices of men who simply refuse to quit, and we are going to explore every single mile of it. Stay relentless in your own pursuits, keep pushing your own boundaries, stay curious about the forgotten shadows of our past, and I will see you in the next video.